you've done a lot of extensive coverage about SB 2753. So kind of just tell me a little bit about what you've learned from covering it so far.
Yeah, so this bill at the beginning of the legislative session started as a completely different bill. When Senator Bob Hall, he's a Republican from North Texas, filed this bill, it was several hundred pages long. It was going to be an overhaul to our elections here in Texas. It included a ban on county-wide voting as well. But throughout the session, that bill changed drastically and it became what it is now, which is one single voting period. When I talked to Senator Hall about this, he told me that the bill ended up being a compromise. He's always wanted just one single voting period, which means no break between Friday of early voting and election day. So that weekend, we would still have to vote. So this bill doesn't change the days that we have to do early voting, or that that voters have, the amount of days that voters have to cast their ballot, but it does move that week a little bit forward. Typically in elections where you have state and county offices on the ballot, early voting begins on a Monday. With this bill, voting would begin on a Thursday. And instead of having just one weekend of early voting, we've had two weekends of early voting. This idea of just one single voting period is already in use in more than 20 states across the country. However, the way that it's done in other places, it's very different in the way that our election system here in Texas works, and we can get a little bit into all of that. But the main concerns that I've heard so far with this is that even though in theory, is a good idea because it does give voters 2 weekends instead of just one to go cast their ballot. 2 weekends, of course, is 2 weekends that you need you need election workers to be working. In addition, this bill also requires early voting to be available during holidays, which right now it's not in place. And it also requires additional hours, which again, it's very good for voters, but this bill does not allocate, the state is not allocating any funding and additional resources. So counties like New Essex County, St. Pat County, they're gonna have to figure out how they're gonna make this work. And that's something that, the Secretary of State's office is also gonna have to look into.
And so that was gonna be my next question, because counties are already having a pretty difficult time just having things go as they are, especially more rural counties. So what kind of impacts is this going to have when it comes to staffing, locations, and kind of just getting that funding? Like, how are they going to tap into that?
Yeah, so typically, even, in a county like ours and our neighboring areas, usually the same election workers that are working during early voting are the same workers that are going to be working on election day. Usually, election officials will recruit these folks at the same time, and will train them at the same time. Now, this requirement is raising some concerns for officials, because that break in between that we talked about, right now, those poll workers use it to kind of get some rest and also to start setting up and prepping for election day, which is sometimes, and in some areas, could be a 16-hour day, depending on how many voters are out there. You know that the polls close on election day at 7, but if there's a line out the door, those voters have the right to cast their ballots. So sometimes locations are not closing until 10 o'clock, later than that, whenever everybody's cast their ballot. Another thing that I wanted to raise with you about this is that since there's now just, per this bill, since there's now just one single voting period, there's not going to be at 7 o'clock on election day early voting results. We're not going to have that, because that break in between early voting and election day is not going to exist anymore. So now when polls close at 7, all of those ballots are going to have to be counted, tabulated, all of that is going to have to be processed. So it's very possible that we are not going to, and like I mentioned earlier, if a polling location is not fully closed because voters are not done voting until 10 o'clock, preliminary results are not going to be ready until those come back. And so that's one thing that it's also important for voters to get familiar with, and for candidates to get familiar with, that they're not going to know really probably until hours later.
And so one thing you had talked about earlier was the organization and how it can be a little different depending on where it's at. I know you talked about how other places have already done this process and it's done differently. How does Texas fare kind of just in how we would implement it versus how other people have already had familiarity with this process?
So another thing to consider and that election officials are looking into right now as they work to see how they're going to implement this is, can we pull it off? Other places have pulled it off, and one example that I can give you is Colorado. The state of Colorado does this. They do it really well, but there's a few things that they have that we don't have. Colorado is a mainly vote by mail state. So there's no restrictions in Colorado to who can vote by mail. So since the majority of folks in Colorado vote by mail, on election day, you don't have long lines of people. And also another thing is that Texas right now, there's some counties that use vote centers, the vote centers that you can go and cast a ballot at anywhere in your county, right? We don't have those all across the state in Texas. Only 99 counties in Texas have vote centers. The rest are precinct by precinct voting locations, which means on election day, you have to go to your assigned precinct, which means if you have to go to an assigned precinct during election day, that means that election officials probably have to staff more locations. In Colorado, that's not the case. It's all vote centers. So that state with that system in place has fewer polling locations that they have to staff, which means they have less equipment that they have to, equip those polling locations with, and fewer workers that they require. In addition, the state of Colorado reimburses local jurisdictions each time a state or a federal office is on the ballot, which helps those local jurisdictions pull off those elections. Texas doesn't do that. So, and this bill also doesn't provide any funding for any additional polling locations that may be necessary, those additional hours that workers are gonna have to work. Oasis County, Stampak County, all of these counties in our area are gonna have to figure out how that's gonna work and where they're gonna get that funding and those resources.
And when it comes to kind of just that funding, I know for a fact that I've done stories kind of just talking about county budgets, how they can be very tight and they have to operate on kind of a penny pinching scale. And so when you add kind of an additional cost or something that they would have to consider, what kind of ripple effects could this one piece of legislation have when it comes to the entire body of county government?
Yeah, I think this is going to be something that our county commissioners are going to really have to look at and, consider whether they are going to be able to comply with this law. There have been laws, election and voting laws in the past that have had similar concerns where counties are just like, we can't comply. Not because we want to break the law, but just because we can't. Because there's some counties where public buildings and facilities there aren't that many. And so they have to lease out buildings that they can use as polling locations. As you know, we can't just have a polling location and be in someone's house or someone's garage or in a barn. There's security factors that you have to take into consideration, and also ADA requirements. Voting locations have to be accessible for everybody. So you can't just pick and choose a location, and so that can come with additional fees. A lot of areas right now don't want to be using schools. Churches are no longer wanting to be used as polling locations, especially if we're going to have Sunday voting. Those areas that use churches as polling locations are probably not going to be able to use them. So those are conversations that are happening right now. So yeah, like you said, counties are really going to have to look at what this is going to take in the next few months. The good side here is that, like I said earlier, this is a bill that if it's implemented correctly, it could be really good for everybody and for voters. Right now, I think those concerns are going to have to be worked out. Election officials are going to have to give their feedback on how that's going to happen and what they're going to do. And like I said, right now, at least the bill gives the Secretary of State's office and election officials some time to do that before it goes into effect. It can't be past 2027. It has to happen before August of 2027. So there's still some time to see how this is actually going to play out.
And with that, kind of give me a timeline of the bill and kind of just things that stood out to you as you kind of just saw it move through the legislature.
Yeah, so like I said, initially it was very restrictive. Senator Bob Hall has for years been wanting to do this one single voting period. It's really interesting how that originated. He has been always concerned that something could happen, or that maybe the votes, that the early voting results or the preliminary early voting results may not be the full early voting results, right? And that gap in between, that weekend in between, as he sees it, is a security concern. Those are, unfunded claims. I mean, there's really no evidence that there's anything going on during that time. I mean, Texas has really, really, really good election security procedures in place. You can actually watch the ballots, the early voting ballots, when they come back. Nueces County has them under surveillance. Several counties, you can go on the county website and watch the ballots just be, in this room and under security. So there's already security systems in place that we have. But he does believe that that is a security risk, and that's why he pushed for so long for that. This bill was actually a bill that no one really expected to move in the way that he initially filed it. But this is the one thing, the single voting period. This is one thing that Democrats and Republicans could agree on that could be good for everybody, right? Like, Republicans here, like Senator Hall, gets the security issue that he has and this concern taken care of. And at the same time, voters get 2 weekends of early voting. As it is, typically the case with election and voting laws, there's so many things that were not considered as the bill changed. I mean, there was a public hearing at the beginning of session about this, but the bill was very different at the by the time it got to the House. Also, it almost didn't meet deadlines. There were committee meetings that were happening, and so the bill was drafted differently. It went to a conference committee where both of the chambers had to agree on the final result of it, and this is kind of what came out of it. Like I said, Senator Hall said it's a compromise. He actually told me on the record that he would have liked to have done fewer days of early voting, but he knew that wasn't going to fly with folks, so the number of early votings are staying the same. But it's something that he's pushed for before. So it was just really interesting to see this develop. And it was kind of a plot twist because we've talked about before how we thought proof of citizenship requirement was going to be the priority bill. And it was the priority bill. It turned out to be this bill that, Republicans, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, hailed as the election integrity bill that Republicans and Democrats were supporting this session. So it was really interesting, and just, in the game of how this legislative session went on, it was just really interesting to see it.
And for people who may not have followed the legislative session all the way through, kind of just talk to me right now about where this bill sits now and kind of just how it would be implemented?
Yeah, so this bill is now headed to the governor's desk. He has, I believe, until June 22nd to either sign it or veto it. He could still say, no, this is not, I don't like this. But he also doesn't have to sign this bill for it to take effect. The governor is not required to sign every single bill. So, yeah, we're waiting to see if, he takes any action. Really, we don't expect that. This is probably going to move. Like I mentioned earlier, right now, the Secretary of State's office is required under this bill to talk to counties about the concerns that we just discussed and to really work out how this is going to be implemented. The Secretary of State's office then is going to be required to produce a report for the legislature to let them know, hey, if we're going to pull this off, we need to do this, this, and this, or hey, we're not going to be able to do this. We need to rework this, And so the Secretary of State's office has until August of 2027 to do that. So there is still some time. Voters right now are not going to see this change, in the next election in November. So there's still some time to kind of get used to all of the changes. There's going to be a lot of voter education happening. Probably your election officials want your feedback about how you feel about this, especially if you're an election worker. Is this going to make you want to work those hours, or are you maybe going to think about not working elections anymore? That's something also that I'm interested in hearing, from people about.
And I wanted to save my best question for last, but when we have this discussion, you look at both sides of it, from the people who essentially get more time, especially if they can't take off to go vote, and then you also look at it from the election worker standpoint of, are we going to be overworked? Are we going to get paid more? Are we going to have those resources? And so when you look at it, if you're somebody who maybe can't pull away to vote, or you maybe couldn't, you didn't have all that additional time, how can this really benefit people who maybe have a hard time getting to the polls or taking away from a very busy schedule or work life?
Well, in all honesty, most people are not thinking about elections until maybe the day before election day, maybe until election day, right? So I have heard from folks who are out there, voting rights groups, and also, just election administrators, who do think that having that Monday, having that Saturday, Sunday, and Monday before election day to be really good for voters, because they're thinking about the election. But, if you missed out during early voting and it's Saturday and you're like, oh, well, I want to go do it now because, election day is on Tuesday. Right now, you wouldn't be able to do that. But under this new law, you would be able to do that. You would have, that Sunday and that Monday even. You don't have to wait until election day. So I would be interested to see if this does increase turnout in Texas, because we are one of the states that has the lowest turnout in the country. So like I said earlier, I think what happens a lot of times is that lawmakers aren't thinking about those logistical things that you need to think about to pull something like this off. That could be really good, but if not done well, it can also be really problematic. I mean, if it turns out that counties are just not gonna have the workers and the buildings to do this, are we just gonna not have this opportunity that could be really good for voters? So those are just really, really important aspects that we need to look at. But yeah, I mean, I would be really interested to see if turnout increases here in our state.
All right, and thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate you for taking time out of your day to come speak with me about this bill.
Thank you.